The next time you fill your gas tank or pay your electricity bill, or notice that the price of everything from groceries to airline tickets has shifted since last month, I want you to think about a narrow strip of water in the Persian Gulf that is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. That is the Strait of Hormuz. And right now, two contradictory things are simultaneously true about it. Iran has officially declared it open, and the United States has maintained a naval posture that effectively makes it a sanctioned transit zone for Iranian-origin cargo. Both of those statements are accurate. They are also incompatible, and the incompatibility between them is not a diplomatic oversight or a communications failure. It is the deliberate architecture of a broken contract, a situation in which both parties are maintaining parallel official narratives about a body of water that moves roughly 20% of the world's oil supply every single day.
Exhales 20%. That is the number that connects a geopolitical dispute in the Persian Gulf to the price of everything in your daily life. The headline story is Iran opening Hormuz. The forensic story, the one that actually explains what this means for energy prices, for supply security, and for the alternative routes the world would scramble to use if that opening ever became a closure, is the U.S. blockade that never officially got called a blockade. Tonight I want to tell you that story, and what it means for you specifically.
I have spent years analyzing how choke points function as instruments of geopolitical pressure, not just militarily but economically, through their effects on insurance markets, shipping routes, commodity pricing, and the long-term infrastructure decisions that governments and energy companies make when they calculate how much they can rely on any single transit corridor. What the historical record shows is that the most consequential choke point events are rarely the ones that make headlines. They are the ones that quietly restructure the global energy architecture in the years that follow. Hormuz is at that inflection point right now. Let me show you why. One sentence. Iran opening the Strait of Hormuz is a diplomatic signal aimed at domestic and regional audiences, while the U.S. naval posture that constitutes the functional blockade of Iranian-origin exports remains fully operational, and the gap between those two realities is already forcing a permanent restructuring of global LNG trade, alternative pipeline infrastructure, and the energy security calculations of every major Asian importing economy. Start with the legal baseline because it matters for understanding why the current situation is a broken contract rather than simply a dispute. The Strait of Hormuz is an international waterway. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, vessels of all nations have the right of transit passage through international straits used for international navigation. Both Iran and Oman share territorial waters in the strait. Both are UNCLOS parties. The right of transit passage is not discretionary. It is a legal obligation. Iran has threatened to close the strait multiple times in its history, in 1987, in 2011, in 2018, and most recently during the current escalation cycle. It has never actually done so for a sustained period, because the economic consequences of closure would fall on Iran's own export revenues as severely as on any importing country. Iranian oil and gas must transit Hormuz to reach markets.
Closing the strait to everyone means closing it to yourself. The U.S. naval presence in the Persian Gulf, the Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain, the carrier strike groups that rotate through the region, has historically been justified as protecting the freedom of navigation that UNCLOS guarantees. The broken contract is this: that same naval presence is now being used not to protect freedom of navigation universally, but to selectively enforce sanctions against Iranian-origin cargo while allowing all other transit. That is not freedom of navigation. It is a choke point under a different legal label. And the distinction matters enormously for how the world calculates its energy security.
Now examine what Iran actually did when it declared Hormuz open. The announcement was made through official channels, covered extensively by state media, and framed as a sovereign decision by Iran to de-escalate and demonstrate good faith. All of that is accurate at the surface level. At the forensic level, it is theater, not in the dismissive sense that it means nothing, but in the precise sense that it is a performance designed for specific audiences. The primary audience is domestic. Iranian citizens who have been living under the economic consequences of sanctions and military pressure need to see their government in a position of agency rather than pure reaction.
An official declaration that Iran is opening Hormuz positions the Islamic Republic as a state making sovereign choices, not a government cornered by external pressure. The secondary audience is regional: Gulf states, Asian importers, and European energy consumers who need to assess whether the strait is operationally safe for their tankers. The announcement gives them a diplomatic cover to continue transiting even as the underlying U.S. pressure remains. What the announcement did not do is change the operational reality for Iranian-origin crude. Tankers carrying Iranian oil still face the same secondary sanctions pressure, the same insurance complications from P&I clubs operating under Western jurisdiction, and the same risk of U.S. naval interdiction that existed before the announcement. Iran opening Hormuz for Iranian oil is like a restaurant announcing it is open for business, while the health department has revoked its license to serve certain menu items. The doors are open. The specific items you came for are still unavailable through official channels.
The forensic record of choke point crises gives us a precise template for what happens when a major transit corridor becomes genuinely unreliable. The Suez Canal closure of 1956 to 1957, and again from 1967 to 1975, produced two distinct responses. The immediate response was route diversion, tankers rounding the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days to journey times, and significantly increasing freight costs. The longer-term response was infrastructure investment, larger tankers designed to make the Cape route economical, pipeline construction bypassing the canal, and a permanent restructuring of shipping economics that outlasted the crisis by decades. The 1973 Arab oil embargo produced the same two-phase response:
immediate, price shock, rationing, economic disruption across all importing economies. Longer term, the International Energy Agency was created specifically to coordinate strategic petroleum reserve releases. North Sea and Alaskan development was accelerated. Nuclear power received massive investment across France, Japan, and Germany, and energy efficiency standards were imposed on vehicles for the first time. The embargo lasted less than a year. The infrastructure and policy response it triggered reshaped the global energy system for the next 50 years. The historical template is clear. Choke point crises do not just disrupt energy markets in the short term. They permanently restructure the architecture of global energy supply. The question for Hormuz in 2026 is not whether the strait will be closed tomorrow. It is whether the combination of the U.S. functional blockade and the ongoing threat of Iranian closure has already crossed the threshold that triggers the long-term restructuring response. The answer, in LNG markets and pipeline investment decisions, is yes. And it happened faster than most analysts expected.
Here is the angle that the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing. The genuine contest for what replaces Hormuz as the primary energy transit architecture is already underway, and the decisions being made right now will define energy security for the next generation. The most immediate alternative for Gulf crude exports is the East-West pipeline across Saudi Arabia, the Petroline, which runs from the eastern province to Yanbu on the Red Sea, bypassing Hormuz entirely. Its capacity is approximately 5 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia has invested in expanding it specifically as a Hormuz contingency, but 5 million barrels per day is a fraction of the roughly 21 million barrels that transit Hormuz daily. It is a partial hedge, not a replacement. The UAE has the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, ADCOP, running to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, bypassing Hormuz for UAE exports.
Capacity, approximately 1.5 million barrels per day. Again, a partial hedge for a specific exporter, not a systemic solution. For Kuwaiti, Iraqi, Qatari, and Iranian crude, there is no comparable bypass infrastructure. They are fully Hormuz dependent. Qatar's LNG exports, which supply approximately 30% of global LNG trade and are the primary energy source for significant portions of Europe, Japan, and South Korea. transit Hormuz without alternative routing. There is no pipeline from Qatar to anywhere outside the Gulf. Every molecule of Qatari LNG that reaches a European terminal, a Japanese power plant, or a South Korean petrochemical complex passed through the Strait of Hormuz at some point in its journey. This is the supply route vulnerability that the coverage is not connecting to the Hormuz story. A genuine closure would not just disrupt oil markets. It would simultaneously disrupt the LNG supply that Europe has been pivoting toward since the 2022 Russian gas cutoff. The infrastructure response to that vulnerability is already visible in investment decisions. Australia has accelerated its LNG export capacity expansion specifically as a non-Hormuz-dependent alternative to Qatari supply. U.S. Gulf Coast LNG export terminals, Sabine Pass, Corpus Christi, Freeport, have seen sustained demand from European and Asian buyers specifically because their supply chains do not touch the Persian Gulf. The price premium for non-Hormuz-dependent LNG has become a permanent feature of the market, not a crisis period anomaly. That premium is a direct transmission mechanism from the Hormuz situation to your energy bill.
China, India, Japan, and South Korea collectively account for the majority of Hormuz transiting crude imports. Each of them is navigating the U.S. blockade and the Iranian theater differently, and each navigation strategy has direct implications for where oil prices settle. China continues to absorb Iranian crude through the shadow fleet infrastructure we covered in a previous video, the Malaysian waypoint, the teapot refineries, the yuan settlement mechanism. For China, Hormuz's official status is largely irrelevant to its Iranian oil supply, because that supply is already operating outside the official framework. What China is watching is whether the U.S. naval presence escalates to the point of physically interdicting Chinese-flagged or Chinese interest vessels. That threshold has not been crossed. Beijing is calibrating its behavior to stay just below it.
Curious, India has taken a different approach. New Delhi has negotiated specific sanctions carve-outs for certain categories of Iranian trade, maintained its relationship with Iranian port infrastructure at Chabahar, which it has developed specifically as an alternative to Pakistani ports for Central Asian trade, and has been more directly public than China about its refusal to treat U.S. secondary sanctions as binding on Indian sovereign trade decisions. India's approach is legal contestation rather than shadow evasion. Both approaches are producing the same practical outcome: continued access to discounted Iranian crude. Japan and South Korea, as formal U.S. allies with significant military dependency on the American security umbrella, have largely complied with sanctions against Iranian crude. But both have been aggressive buyers of alternative supply. Australian LNG, U.S. Gulf Coast LNG, increased volumes from UAE and Saudi Arabia, and both have made public statements about the unacceptability of any Hormuz disruption to their energy security. Tokyo and Seoul are the importers most directly exposed to the LNG vulnerability, and both are investing in storage capacity and supply diversification at rates not seen since the 1970s oil shocks.
Now make it concrete. The Hormuz situation transmits to everyday prices through three channels, each operating on a different timeline. The first channel is immediate: oil price volatility. Every credible threat to Hormuz transit, an Iranian naval exercise, a U.S. interdiction incident, a tanker seizure, produces an immediate spike in oil futures prices, which transmits to gasoline prices within weeks. The war risk premium currently embedded in Brent crude pricing reflects the Hormuz uncertainty. Analysts at the EIA and IEA have estimated that premium at somewhere between $3 and $8 per barrel under current conditions, meaning that if Hormuz were fully secure and sanctions-free, crude would be trading measurably cheaper than it is today. The second channel is medium-term, LNG pricing. European natural gas prices, which have restructured entirely since 2022 toward LNG dependence, are directly affected by Qatari LNG availability, which is directly affected by Hormuz security. The TTF benchmark in Europe, the JKM benchmark in Asia, both carry a Hormuz component that feeds through to industrial electricity costs, heating bills, and the production costs of everything manufactured with energy-intensive processes. The third channel is structural and slow-moving, but the most significant. The investment decisions being made right now about where to build LNG terminals, which pipelines to develop, which energy technologies to accelerate. All of these are being shaped by the calculation that Hormuz cannot be treated as reliably safe.
That calculation is producing a global energy infrastructure that is more expensive, more redundant, and more geographically distributed than what an uncontested Hormuz would have required. That cost is real, it is large, and it will be paid by energy consumers, which means everyone, over the next decade.
Every major actor here faces a version of the same impossible position. Iran wants credit for opening Hormuz without losing the deterrence value of the threat to close it. That requires maintaining both the announcement and the naval capability simultaneously, which means the announcement is theatrical by design, because the moment it becomes operationally real, Iran loses its primary leverage over the entire global energy system. The United States wants to maintain maximum pressure on Iranian oil exports without triggering the Hormuz closure that would produce a global energy crisis it would be blamed for. That requires maintaining the functional blockade without calling it a blockade, which means the legal fiction of freedom of navigation must be preserved even as it is selectively applied. The broken contract that results from these two positions is not an accident. It is the equilibrium that both parties currently prefer to any alternative.
Asian importers want access to the cheapest available crude without absorbing the political cost of publicly defying U.S. sanctions. That requires the shadow infrastructure, the diplomatic carve-outs, and the public statements about energy security sovereignty that allow continued Iranian import without formal sanctions breach. The result is a global oil market with a permanent two-tier structure, the official market and the shadow market, each pricing Hormuz risk differently, each transmitting that risk to consumers through different mechanisms.
Scenario 1. Managed ambiguity continues. Both official narratives persist. Iran keeps Hormuz nominally open. The U.S. maintains its functional blockade. Oil markets price a war risk premium of $3 to $8 per barrel as a permanent feature. LNG infrastructure investment outside the Gulf accelerates. Energy prices remain elevated relative to a sanctions-free baseline. This is the current trajectory and the most likely near-term outcome. Scenario 2. Escalation triggers a genuine transit disruption. A naval incident, an Iranian seizure of a tanker, a U.S. interdiction of a vessel with Chinese or Indian interests, a miscalculation by either navy, produces a temporary Hormuz closure or a sharp increase in transit risk. Oil prices spike to levels not seen since 2008. LNG spot prices in Europe and Asia reach emergency levels.
Strategic petroleum reserve releases are coordinated through the IEA. The disruption lasts weeks, not months, but the insurance and routing premium it embeds in energy markets persists for years. Scenario 3. A diplomatic resolution produces a genuine sanctions framework that normalizes Iranian oil exports. This requires a U.S. political willingness that does not currently exist, a verified Iranian nuclear constraint that Tehran has not offered, and a regional security architecture that satisfies Israeli and Saudi concerns that have not been addressed. Each of those conditions is independently difficult. Together, they represent a diplomatic achievement of a complexity that the current international environment is not producing. But if it happened, the energy price implications would be significant and immediate. The war risk premium disappears, Qatari LNG competes on pure economics again, and the non-Hormuz infrastructure premium compresses. Scenario 4. The long-term infrastructure response makes Hormuz strategically less relevant. Australian LNG expansion, U.S. Gulf Coast export growth, Saudi and UAE pipeline investment, and European storage and efficiency gains gradually reduce the proportion of global energy supply that is Hormuz dependent. This does not eliminate the choke point's strategic significance. It reduces the magnitude of the shock any disruption can produce. This is the scenario that energy markets are already investing in. It takes 10 to 15 years to materialize at scale. It is already underway.
If you are an informed adult trying to understand what the Hormuz situation actually means for your energy costs, your savings, and your economic planning, here is the clearest summary I can give you. In the short term, the war risk premium is real and already in your prices. The gap between what energy would cost in a Hormuz-secure world and what it costs today is measurable and documented. You are paying it every time you fill your tank or pay your utility bill. In the medium term, the LNG restructuring is the most consequential development.
Europe's pivot to LNG after the Russian gas cutoff created a structural demand for non-Russian supply that has permanently tightened the global LNG market. Adding Hormuz risk to Qatari LNG, which is the primary swing supplier in that market, means the tightness is structural rather than cyclical. Prices will not return to pre-2022 levels regardless of what happens in Ukraine or the Persian Gulf, because the infrastructure that made cheap LNG available has been permanently restructured by sequential geopolitical shocks. In the long term, the energy transition is being accelerated by Hormuz risk in ways that are rarely acknowledged in the coverage of either the geopolitical story or the climate story. Every government that calculates Hormuz as an unreliable choke point has a stronger economic case for domestic renewable energy, which is geopolitically immune to transit disruption by definition. The broken contract in the Persian Gulf is one of the most powerful arguments for energy independence, and it is making that argument in the most persuasive language available, the language of prices.
Let me pull this together. Iran opened Hormuz. The U.S. kept the blockade. Both are true, and the incompatibility between them is the broken contract that is structuring global energy markets right now. The theater of the Iranian announcement is designed for domestic and regional consumption. The reality of the U.S. naval posture is the operative fact for anyone trying to move Iranian-origin crude through the strait through official channels. The LNG story is the angle that connects this directly to your energy bill, in a way that the oil market story alone does not fully capture. Qatar's 30% share of global LNG trade transits Hormuz with no alternative routing.
Every scenario in which Hormuz becomes genuinely contested is simultaneously a scenario in which European and Asian LNG markets face an acute supply shock, on top of markets that are already tight from the Russian gas restructuring. The compounding of those two shocks is the energy security scenario that governments are quietly investing to prevent, and that energy companies are quietly pricing into their long-term infrastructure commitments. The historical template is clear. The 1956 Suez closure gave us the supertanker and the Cape route. The 1973 embargo gave us the IEA and the Strategic Petroleum Reserve System. The Hormuz broken contract of 2026 is giving us accelerated Australian LNG, U.S. Gulf Coast export infrastructure, Saudi bypass pipelines, and a permanent two-tier oil market with Iranian crude priced at a structural discount. Those are not temporary crisis responses. They are the permanent new architecture of global energy supply. Here is the question I want you to sit with. Given everything this means for energy prices, supply security, and the long-term infrastructure being built right now, which of the four scenarios I described do you think is most likely? And what would it take to change that trajectory? Drop your answer in the comments. The most analytically specific responses I will read in the follow-up.